the Brothers Karamazov, Book 11, Chapter 6. In this chapter, Ivan goes to meet and talk with Smerdyakov in the hospital. But as he's on his way to do that, from the previous chapter, we find out that this is not the first meeting, but instead it's the third. So we go back in time in this chapter and the next chapter, in 6 and 7 of Book 11, to see the previous conversations, the meanwhile ... conversations between Ivan and Smerdyakov. So for the next 3 chapters, 3 conversations between Ivan and Smerdyakov. Now, we get to see the not so much the murder, but the aftermath of the murder of Fyodor from Ivan's perspective. And so that's the perspective we get in this chapter and the next 2. And so we're looking at it mostly through Ivan's eyes. At least we're following Ivan around. And so he's got kind of, as I see it, 4 things going on. He's rational. So first, he has the evidence. Second, he has his conversation with Dimitri. Third, and this is mentioned at both the beginning and the end of this chapter, he has Alyosha's perspective. And then fourth, he has Smerdyakov's perspective. And so as we see the murder from Ivan's perspective, the mystery, I think, sort of heightens as to who did it, who's responsible for Fyodor's murder. So first, he has the evidence, and all the evidence admittedly points to Dimitri. All the circumstantial evidence, and it's piles, it's overwhelming. It's not 1 or 2 things. There's testimony from people who don't know each other, people in different places, people with no motivation to lie whatsoever, even a couple people who would have the motivation to lie to get Dimitri off. All of the evidence points toward Dimitri being the murderer, and no evidence points to anybody else being the murderer. So number 1, being a rational person, Ivan looks at the evidence, and it all points to Dimitri, and none of it points to anyone else. Number 2, he talks to Dimitri himself, and before we see that, we get an omniscient narrator perspective, where we learn that Ivan absolutely loathes entirely his brother Dimitri, so he doesn't want to believe him necessarily. He wants to think the worst about him, but still he goes and sees him, and we learn from that interaction that Dimitri does nothing to convince Ivan of anything. In fact, Dimitri sort of agrees with the circumstantial evidence all being against him, and on top of that, he doesn't seem motivated to convince anyone of his innocence, or not anyone. He doesn't seem motivated, especially to convince Ivan of his innocence. Because on the one hand, he just has to say, you know what, you're right. All the evidence does point to me, but it wasn't me. And then furthermore, you're the last kind of guy that I feel like trying to vindicate myself in front of, because you don't believe in morality at all. Everything is permissible in your worldview. So I don't really care about what you say about me. It doesn't bother me. Your unbelieving perspective really means nothing to me. So it's pretty strong case so far. So number 1, the circumstantial evidence all points to Dimitri, and Dimitri offers nothing in his own defense. But thirdly, what does bother Ivan is Alyosha. When you think highly of a person, then you think highly of their opinion about something. And so Alyosha's lone, completely against the grain opinion is that Dimitri is in fact not guilty, and that Smerdyakov probably is guilty. And so Ivan would like to chalk this up to just brotherly love, but he knows that Alyosha, as this faithful student of Zosima, when you're honest with yourself, that honesty with oneself translates to love and a discerning spirit, and you're able to understand people because you're not blinded by the lies that you've told yourself. And so Ivan sees this, and it's an undeniable trait in Zosima's student, his brother Alyosha. And so it's bothersome that Alyosha seems so sure of the fact that it wasn't Dimitri. And on top of that, it's even more bothersome that on top of Alyosha's confidence that it wasn't Dimitri, that Alyosha, kind of like Dimitri, doesn't seem that intent, it doesn't seem important to him to vindicate Dimitri to Ivan. When they talk, Ivan always has to bring the thing up. Alyosha isn't even worried to talk about it with him. And so those two things bother Ivan, that Alyosha seems sure that it is not Dimitri, and he seems so sure that he doesn't even make the effort to try to convince Ivan of it. And so those are three things that I think are mentioned in the chapter, but the heart of the chapter, as the title indicates, and in the next two chapters, is a conversation between Ivan and Smerdyakov. And so Ivan, because of the first two things, because of the circumstantial evidence and because his own inquiries with Dimitri, Ivan is pretty convinced of the guilt of his brother Dimitri for the murder of Fyodor, but he still goes to see Smerdyakov anyway, because there's some things that, even though he's convinced that Dimitri is guilty, there are some things that definitely still bother him. And what bother him is that the words and actions of Smerdyakov, and this is really key, the next thing I'm about to say, Ivan's own words and actions don't match up with the story that they're both going with. And so Ivan can, it's a psychologically complex, it's a true to life novel. And so both things can be true simultaneously. Ivan can be convinced that Dimitri is guilty, but yet he can still be bothered by the fact that there seems to be some parts of the story that don't fit together, all centering around himself and Smerdyakov. And so that's what he wants to have cleared up in this conversation with Smerdyakov. And so immediately Ivan doesn't beat around the bush. He just starts asking questions, direct, pointed, probing questions. First of all, to the doctors, can Smerdyakov, is he able, is he conscious, is he aware enough to answer my questions? And then as soon as he's assured that that is the case by Smerdyakov himself, he starts asking questions such as, how could you predict your seizure? The seizures are by their very nature a surprise. How could you know the day or the hour of your seizure? That doesn't make sense to me. Secondly, why were you so keen? Why were you so interested on sending me away? That didn't make sense. Why were you trying to get me away, but also not get me away very far? That doesn't make sense. And third, why did you bring up the fact that you are really good at faking these seizures? That stuff doesn't make sense. But Smerdyakov has an answer for each of those things. It's you misunderstood me, or the pressure of all these threats brought the seizure on. So Smerdyakov has a decent enough answer for each of Ivan's inquiries. But Ivan is also bothered by himself, and he thinks to himself, why do I feel guilty? Why do I feel bad? Why do I feel manipulated and used when Smerdyakov says some of these things? And why don't my actions make me feel good in my conscience? Why is my tummy telling me that something is wrong, even though my brain is telling me that I'm absolutely right? And so again, we see that played out in miniature, tiny Lego size. The mega themes of the novel are here contained in this chapter, and that is that rationally Ivan is right, but really he's wrong. Rationally, it makes sense if you follow from a wrong premise. The wrong premise being he's not the kind of person who would want his father dead. If you follow from that false premise, then rationally it all makes sense. But it's a false premise, and so all of the evidence and all of the lack of convincing argumentation on Dimitri's part don't change the fact that Dimitri is actually not guilty, and that Smerdyakov is a giant liar, and that Ivan is somewhat responsible for Smerdyakov in that he knows his own words, his own actions betray some part of the guilt, in that He knew he was a scoundrel, that he second guessed himself in going away, and that he lured in that second story balcony, waiting for something to happen to his father, and knowing that he was going to let something bad happen to his father. So all those actions, both of Smerdyakov and Ivan, both show that though rationally they have no culpability, there's a reality that transcends just a burden of proof, and that bothers Ivan. It bothers Ivan because there's this gnawing sense of guilt, even though with his brain he believes Dimitri to be guilty.